Good evening, and thank you for joining us for tonight's program, Body and Immaterial, a conversation of sculpture and painting. My name is Robert Benitez, curator of the Lancaster Museum of Art and History. And on behalf of the museum and the city of Lancaster, I would like to thank each of you and each of our panelists, Dr. Jill Moniz, Annie Buckley, and of course, H.K. Zamani, who I will refer to as Habib, for being with us this evening to discuss his work in the new exhibition, Body and Immaterial, a conversation of sculpture and painting, a 20-year survey. Before we begin, I would like to invite viewers who would prefer to listen to this discussion in Spanish to use Zoom's simultaneous interpretation feature below by clicking on the interpretation button in your user menu and selecting Spanish. To hear the interpreted language only, click on Mute Original Audio. Curatorial assistants Joshua Rombawa and Caitlin Spencer will be able to help with the interpretation questions in the chat box. I would like to begin this evening's program with an acknowledgement of our Indigenous communities here in the Antelope Valley, where the Lancaster Museum of Art and History is located, including the Tataviam, Ben-Yume, Chemiwevi, Serrano, Kawayasu, and Katanamuk peoples. We at the museum recognize our position as guests on this land and seek to move conversations which highlight Native voices, stories, and perspectives forward. With that, I'd like to introduce today's participants. Jill Moniz is an independent curator of visual narratives. Her curatorial investigations support local artists and communities in site-specific installations, programming, and exhibitions. She works closely with multiple arts organizations in Los Angeles and around the world. Her noted exhibitions in Los Angeles include LA Blacksmith at the California African American Museum, The Riddle Effect at Craft Contemporary, and Photoflux Unshuttering LA, currently on view at the Getty Museum until October 10th. Annie Buckley is a multidisciplinary artist, writer, and curator with an emphasis on art and social justice, and is the founder and director of the Prison Arts Collective, a statewide program dedicated to expanding access to the transformative power of the arts to incarcerated people. Buckley's research and creative practice is focused on socially engaged art, community partnerships, critical and curatorial projects. She began the Prison Arts Collective in 2013 and has been awarded over $2 million in prestigious grants and contracts from the California Arts Council, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and the National Endowment for the Arts. She is the author of over 250 reviews and essays on contemporary art published in Art Forum, Art in America, The Huffington Post, and others. H.K. Zamani, of course, is an Iranian-American multidisciplinary artist and founder of Post, an alternative exhibition space in Los Angeles. Teetering between the obscure and the subjective, his work examines the synthesis of artistic medium, conception, and human interaction. Interplay between materiality and interpretation are a key component of his work, and he utilizes this exchange to challenge Eastern and Western expectations, as well as the ephemerality and significance of the social structures that humans have built. H.K. Zamani received his Master of Fine Arts from Painting from Claremont Graduate University. He is a recipient of the City of Los Angeles Award and the California Community Foundation grants. His work is part of collections of the Berkeley Museum of Art and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. He currently works and resides in Los Angeles. Thank you each for being here today. Though I am the moderator, I've prepared a few questions for this evening. This discourse should really be between the three of you. To start the question off, I'd like to turn it over to Habib, who would like to read a short passage.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all for being here. The short statement, conflating three-dimensional and two-dimensional forms is a recurring theme in my work of the last decades, with sculpture representing the body and painting representing immaterial. My new works, Inadvertent Protagonists, focus on the idea of coexistence in their imageries. The paintings that converse with their sculptural counterparts. As an Iranian-American artist, I continue to explore my culturality by superimposing of both cultures in my work. The binary character structure of these new explorations is a preoccupation with dualities within self or in contrast to others, and the goal of coexistence without violence.
Thank you, Habib.
You're welcome.
I think that gives us a great framework actually for the first question, which is to you, Habib. The exhibition Body and Immaterial, A Conversation of Sculpture and Painting is a 20-year survey of distinct but related series. For our viewers who may not be as familiar with your MOAH, what visual or conceptual through lines would you hope a viewer in our gallery engages with?
I think the statement talks about the combining of two-dimensional with three-dimensional elements. And I think from the very beginning, I found that sculpture was more comfortable to work with because it had a body, three-dimensional body, and painting I found more challenging and a very different relationship with it because it keeps you at a distance and you can only enter it conceptually or visually. So here, when I use the term immaterial in relation to painting, I'm referencing this conceptual relationship with it, this visual relationship with it, while with sculpture, it's a more physical one. And of course, I've used different sculptural elements. Sometimes it has been just an armature that has influenced the surface of the painting, like the fabric and armature works, or where the wall works have come onto the floor and have become sculpture and architecture. And then painting the form, which is architectural and sculptural, is again a way of relating the two together. But it was absent from my work. This form, reference to form, was more ambiguous for about 10 years that I made abstract paintings from 2009 until 2018, when sculpture began to re-emerge. And again, in this case, the sculpture came after the paintings, and the images were in the paintings first, and they were mimicked as sculptural presences, and also flipped, so they would be in a conversation, and it could be between the painting and sculpture inside the work.
I think one of the through lines for me is really, Habib, what you just said is architecture. So both the architecture of form that you have in the 2D and 3D works, and your, and the architecture of your thinking, of the conceptual frameworks that you use, that are very much necessary for your work and for you as an artist in your practice. And so I think that, any viewer who can enter into the space and find a through line through it would come away with that sense of really defined and thought out structure and architecture of ideas, of forms, of images that all come together in what you do.
It's crazy. It seemed like I started studying architecture first, and to still have it come through like that.
It informs you, it informs, and it comes in, obviously, and one of the things that I am so intrigued with is, that you are drawn to historical architecture, obviously, as a means of sort of deconstructing the conceptual architecture of other ideas. So you're constantly playing with the notion of structure and form as a means, both as a modality and as an infrastructural way that things are built, and then things can be entered into, pulled apart, unpacked, and built up again in a new way.
Yeah, I think my tendency is to work very intuitively. So oftentimes, the work doesn't appear to be based on concepts. They just emerge naturally, and they relate, to what came before them and continue.
I feel like I focus more on your performances in writing about your work this time, but I was so happy to be able to do that because I feel like to me, the juice of like the feeling and embodiment and viscerality of your expression is like very, kind of feels buried a little bit, like it's not the foreground in the paintings and the sculptures, like the architecture and the conceptual ideas are, but in the performances, it's just the whole thing, and they live in this other space of a surreal, actually like surrealist realism in this weird way, because I feel like it is a depiction of life through this surreal lens. So it's a very sort of different through line, but it lives side by side with the other work, similar to how you're talking about wanting the 2D and the 3D to have a conversation.
Right.
It's like the performance is like the beating heart.
Yeah, and I have rationalized that I've been working within the extended field of painting, and so everything that I have done, I've still associated with having been a painter, having studied painting, and having found painting to be the most challenging for me of the different media. And I suppose, I don't know, I think sometimes the performances were oftentimes emotionally motivated, because if you look at how often I perform, it's not how a performance artist practices their performance art activity. They're like doing it daily or weekly, but I do the paintings daily and weekly, and then the performances speak in a way that the paintings and the other presentations don't. The immediacy, and of course, you ultimately have to experience them.
Do you really feel that way, that they speak differently? I mean, I'm with Annie in the sense that it feels very integrated to me, that these are all parts of a whole. It's very interesting that you see them as very separate.
Well, like for example, when I was in Prague and I performed with Tomáš Ruler, and I felt like the ugly American there, and I didn't understand the language. All I could hear was Americans this and Americans that, and I didn't know exactly what they were saying. I just felt there was serious distance between us, because especially back then, half of them didn't have passports. So how could there be a dialogue? How could be a second component to the show when, it's Czechoslovakia, it's not the Czech Republic yet, in '89. So when I asked Tomáš if he would throw mud at me, it was more like feeling like the ugly American and, wanting to be punished for it. And, he said he'll think about it. And then he came back and he said, well, yeah, if you throw mud back at me and and if we could have a wash. So, you know, he thought more like a performance artist. You know, for me, it was more, hey, you know, this is how I feel. You know, I had a different idea. I thought, oh, we'll have a panel and we'll throw mud, and then the record of this will be the painting behind me. But, you know, of course, it became more interesting without that. So oftentimes that's how the performances came to be. The veil performances, you know, the first one is in 2001. You know, I'm in a exhibition called Big Plastic. It's immediately the same time, or right after, about a month after the September 11. And so Big Plastic, you know, it just didn't make sense to me. And only the day before the actual opening did I tell Jay Bilali that I'd be performing inside this, you know, corridor of fabric. Yeah, it was plastic fabric, but, you know, it just didn't make sense to have a show about big plastic when, you know, we just had the Twin Towers come down. So, of course, wearing the red veil, I was afraid, but I was just, I couldn't help but to do this and put myself in that position and express my fear and anxiety about being the other. You know, I even experienced that somewhat with my family, where they, my American family, that you're not one of us. So in that sense, I keep thinking about the performances being emotionally motivated, but yeah, there was always this interest of, hey, how does this gel with the rest of your work? So the fabric and armature, of course, and the fabric of the veil. So yeah, they're all very much interconnected.
But it's also
I
interesting
think,
to me. Oh, sorry, Annie.
oh, it's okay. I'll go after.
I just, you know, when you talk about duality and binary and the ways that you see yourself and your own identity as being either, you know, as being an Iranian, an American, and just in the description that you gave us of being in Czechoslovakia and being the ugly American and then being the other, and this sort, you know, the fact that both the binary that exists in the space of art making and the duality that you move through the world with, and many of us othered folk do, you know, move through the world with, is way more than duality. It is occupies something so much bigger and more sort of elusive to name. And I think that for me, it's interesting that you live in that liminal space in your work. And so you say that you focus on the duality, but you really are in the interstitial part. You're in between, and in the part that really sort of matters for others like me, like us, where we have some fugitivity and a little bit of more freedom than being one thing or the other thing. And I think that you do that in your art as well. You know, are they sculptures? Are they paintings? Is it performance? Is it, you know, static? You know, you're constantly challenging yourself and your community and your viewers to engage in something more than just the binary.
Yeah, just to follow up, it worked out to come after, because what I was going to say relates to what you were saying in some sense, that it's interesting, Habib, that you see the performance work as somehow separate or different, or maybe you're not quite qualified because you don't spend as much time on it or what have you. Like the way you speak about it sort of makes it seem like that. And maybe that thinking about it is what gives it such freedom and is what allows it to be in that more playful, spontaneous space, because you have so much more specific training and knowledge in the painting sculpture area. But I would say I agree with Jill that they're so integrated and you can't really have one without the other. And it's not just the forms that's tying them, it's you as the artist. And that artist expression comes through in different ways through all of the pieces. And I think the performance pieces have a level of you that's a little bit more personal and intimate, and your own background and your own experience as a human in a body in the world that is more at the foreground than in the other works. And I think that's really powerful. And maybe that's, I don't know why, but maybe that's why it feels like maybe separate it a little bit. But I think it's a very powerful integrated piece of the whole.
I think for me, if I may, I think there is, you know, power in that interstitial space. I think for me as a queer person, you always sort of exist between binaries, and there's so much power in that sort of third space. I'm thinking about also there's sort of an inherent connection in the spiritual connections of this work too. And that's something when looking and learning about Habib's work, there was that instant sort of connection, this sort of third space, but also this connection to what that space allows, which is those more spiritual, metaphysical connections, if you will. That's what I was most taken by in that body, or in those works, I should say.
I think ultimately, you know, I try to be inside the work and have a real experience with it, and if my audience gets to have that same connection, you know, have a true experience, then, you know, it's a great thing. And of course, I don't want it to stop with the personal, you know, there's personal motivation, but ultimately I want to, you know, work on some universal level. You know, I don't want to make necessarily work that screams my cultural background. And so, you know, I want work that transcends my cultural duality, my sexuality, even, you know.
Can you talk a little bit about why you want that kind of distance? I mean, I think that you're talking about archetypes in a way that I think you already do without having to deny who you are and how meaningful those experiences are in the making.
Yeah, I don't think it's a denial of who I am, but I don't necessarily want to, you know, I guess, I want ultimately the work to speak for itself. So you come upon it, and I hope that anyone can relate to it without necessarily knowing that the person who was the architect was an Iranian American, or I don't know, any other background. Maybe it was partly, I mean, I've been doing this for a very long time, and there weren't really any Iranian artists around me when I began to practice on a professional level. So And I think most of my education was, through these American systems. And so I think there is definitely a difference between the work that I put out there, even though I did not leave Iran till I was 13. And so this space between that Annie talks about being a teenager and adolescent, so a part of you, I think, is formed by that point. But most of my education was a Western education from that point on. So I had to negotiate, this other world, and like Iranians have a difficult time with my work. They don't think that it really acknowledges my Iranian side, and my American friends used to see me as the other, and so I was always in this in-between space.
But that's what's so, that's the universal experience of the other, that it doesn't, you don't have to be from Iran to understand what that is.
Right.
Understand what that feels like, and I think that that's what makes your work so interesting to me. I mean, we have some shared history of migration, but it's also just the experience of people who are othered in the world and in Western systems. And when you can, you give us visual language to both interpret and wholly feel that experience from a different place, from the sort of inside out, where in some ways it is an act of refusal of the binary. We don't have to be either or. We are all of these things at the same time. And so that's the strength of your work. So I didn't mean to, ask you to just say, I'm from Iran and I make artwork. But what I'm saying is, don't deny, and not that you are denying, but, I think that when people use the word universal, people sort of get a little squeamish about what that means. But I think that it is a shared experience that you live in, and that you are giving us a roadmap through.
Right.
And Habib, I think you do. I agree that the work, while I said it's like performances feel more personal and more intimate, I don't think that it's about you per se, but I think like you as the artist, maybe you're the only one could have made it. I mean, hopefully we say that about most artists, if they're really, digging and making work out of their truth. And I think you are. And so because of that, it feels that. And the paintings as well, but it's just harder it's not at the surface in the way that it is in the performances. And but it's there in both of them, but it doesn't feel that it's like about you or biographical. It feels more like we understand that it took your experience to make that. And I mean, just by example, I think like, for example, the veil performances, I mean, they're so unique and fascinating. And it took me a while to really kind of wrap my head around the various things going on. It's not one narrative, it's multiple narratives, and it's also silence, and it's also stillness, and it's completely being there with someone, but it's also completely like denying someone at the same time. So they're very complex in a way that I think critiques both cultures that you come from. And so it's not one answer, but it certainly gets at something that all of us can really think about and challenge us to think about how we see one another and how we exist in the world, which I think is a really important thing that art can do, or that you've been able to do with this art.
And super relevant, obviously, in this moment where we have so many people wanting to strengthen categories of otherness. And the kind of violence that you talked about, you know, is really at a fever pitch right now. And so I think that, you know, work like yours is really important to dismantle some of those systems in ways that we can, in ways that art can.
Happy to do it.
I know we've been talking a lot about the performances. We do have a few of the performances queued up. Annie, did you have any particular that you think would be most relevant?
I mean, if people haven't seen the Veil, since we're talking about that, like the Meridian maybe, or Habib, do you want to look at one of the earlier or different? I would say either Certain Traces or one of the Veil pieces, because they kind of relate to the things that we've been talking about. Do you have a preference, Habib, or another one?
No, you take it.
It's so hard to choose. Okay, let's look at the Meridian only because it shows the Veil and it's shorter. And, you know, in the interest of time, the other one's just a little bit longer.
Great. Josh?
And I think, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think it's, you know, just to look at it and then we can talk about kind of the experience of it. Since I did experience that one in person, I have thoughts about it.
Such a short version.
I know. And the interesting thing about this work, you know, for listeners here to know, is the endurance factor, and the fact that simply standing still, being perceived and being hidden at the same time for 2 hours is an endurance feat that one performer even, you know, got a little ill and almost fainted. I mean, it's quite challenging. So anyway, I guess we could look at it. I mean, I think this goes back to where you both started the conversation with the architecture and the consistent imagery, and the way the fabric becomes the body, and the body is gone and it's still the fabric on the wall. And then that relates, I think, to a lot of your work, sculpture, painting, performance. But then that moment of just being like confronted and confronting in this very specific, very culturally specific, very timely, relevant way is sort of this electric moment in the middle. And then it kind of absorbs back to other elements of your practice, which is more visual, or I don't know, architectural, like you guys were saying, and based in the forms. So it's sort of fascinating that there's this like electric moment in the midst of what really is a mix of sculpture and yeah, I think that's all I was going to say. I have a lot to say about those, but I'm going to wait and hear maybe Jill or you want to comment. I mean, just what's it like experiencing that? I know you've spoken a bit about that, and you think it might be interesting for people to hear.
I think the longest Veil performance was the very first one at the Armory in 2001. And it was, you know, most of them, it's just me performing in the red veil. And I stood for 3 hours for that one. It was a fascinating one. You know, people would walk down this 40-foot corridor, and then 8 feet away from me is when they realize there's a person standing there, and, you know, they're shook up, and I did speak to them with my eyes, try to make them feel comfortable. And it was really beautiful. As they left, they kind of left their traces behind. I could still have the scent that they were wearing, after they would leave. So it was really a real experience. But I admit that many times performing in that red veil, I felt incredibly threatened. It wasn't so bad in LA, but in New York, I was almost molested, because they thought I was a woman. And a couple of big Brooklyn guys were grabbing at me, and then they realized there's a camera on, so they, left. But, there's, definitely that aspect of it.
That is, no, go ahead.
Should we watch another one?
I think that's so powerful too, the way that you say that people didn't notice, that you were there. And I think it relates to some of the things Jill was speaking about how we're seeing one another and who's othered and how that happens in experience. It's not just that you were covered, right? Maybe there's something else going on, and how somehow, because they thought you were a woman, that it was okay to treat you that way, and they thought no camera was on. Like the ideas that we see manifested in that experience that you're sharing. I mean, this is what plays out in the world. This is,
there are
the
fascinating
violence
aspects
of the world.
Yeah, there are fascinating aspects, to the veil. Why is it that it's a patriarchal society, and yet the veil really represents that society? So a female form represents that Islamic culture, or Islamic cultures, and yet there's just so much suffering for the women in those cultures, and I think that's more of a reinvention of the tradition, because at one time men and women wore similar clothing in Arabia. Why is it that now men can wear suits and women still have to wear the veil? Now it's become a dress code. So yeah, it was about the threat of Islamic cultures, all these various layers of meaning associated with the image, and of course a red veil. Who wears a red veil? These are all the way I felt it. There were critiques, and yeah.
Jill,
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Can I just say one thing about this?
Please, yeah, absolutely.
And that is, on the other side of that, patriarchy of Islamic cultures, there's also, all of this racialized projection and erasure from Western categories on what the veil means, and this notion of oppression of women that's only seen through Western white feminist standards of what womanhood is. And and when you look at the Middle East in aggregate, there were certainly, when I was a kid, there were more professional women with multiple degrees, women who were really the architects of their own lives. And that was a very normalizing and normal thing in a lot of the Middle East. So, a lot of what the West thinks about the veil is, again, goes back to that binary, goes back to a sense of, good us, bad them, free us, oppressed them without understanding how much of those constructs are created in the West to oppress and subjugate and silence and normalize a kind of violence against whole groups of people that the West wants to exploit, subjugate, and those things happen all the time. And I think that the work that you do actually challenges people maybe to think about their own assumptions about what the veil is for them, particularly in the West, particularly, I would say, both in New York and LA, places that are seen and conceive of themselves as being incredibly progressive, but are so wedded to systems of inequality and institutionalized violence against others. And so I think that makes your work even, more necessary and successful as a project.
Jill, I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no worries.
Okay. Oh.
Go ahead.
Can I say one thing? Okay. I just think I'm really glad that you shared that, because I was going to say one of the things I think is so interesting since I first learned about those works and saw them, Habib, is what you shared with me, which was that you have a conflicted relationship with the veil, because some members of your family wear it and some don't. And, to what Jill was just speaking about, like Rafia Zakaria is a really amazing writer, recently wrote this book Against White Feminism, just specifically on those issues, and that of course some women are choosing to wear it, and it's through a certain lens that it's so-called bad, but then at the same time it is forced on some women. So it's just complicated in a way that, I know you want to ask your question, so I wouldn't pretend to be able to explain it, but I think your works get at that complexity, which is what I really like about it. But I think that's what I wanted to add.
I totally agree, Annie. Jill, I do have a question for you, sort of in line with this conversation. In your essay, you wrote that Habib's work is always political. You describe his art making, specifically the series and Protagonists, as a subversive act, and you go on to describe the paintings as a kind of exorcism, in which these Black forms are excised from their canvas, revealing their ethereal residue, which I love. In which ways is this act of exorcism a political one?
Well, I mean, Habib might want to answer that question, but I think that, not to put words in his mouth, but I think that all of his work is political. And it is both a responsibility, I think, of someone who has a platform and someone who exists in these multiple dimensions and places and identities, to be able to insist that the viewer look through and experience the work from multiple vantage points and gazes. And so I think for me, in terms of an exorcism, that there is the inadvertent protagonists in particular take on shapes that are very important historically, and also feel very human in a lot of ways. And they're at a human scale. And of course, the larger ones are at a monumental scale. And so as we sort of enter into the work and build a visual literacy of the work, we are, with Habib, shedding literally the layers of enforced and implied meaning that I was just talking about, and looking at the form for what it is, from a human to an object, or from a human to a human, and you get to sort of shake off some of that ghostly residue of what is taught to you in the public sphere, and what you learn in school, and what you see in movies, and what you think that you know about particular cultures, but you really don't. You get little sound bites of meaning, and this work allows us to push away, to really, like I said, shed that and get to the heart of what an experience with just a really sublime object and architecture feels like. Habib, what do you think about that?
Well, when I approach the work, it's more on a personal level. It's challenging myself first and foremost. And for example, in Inadvertent Protagonists, where I cut through the surface, you can talk about this work formally, that we're cutting the surface of the painting, to get to what's underneath, what's beyond the skin, getting to the flesh. And so these figures, become fallen figures, and I speak about them as being portraits, self-portraits, having that kind of a personal relationship with them, that it's not necessarily me and another, but it is me and, the two sides of me. So, there's that, of course, the personal relationship with the work. But ultimately, I think we all want the work to go beyond the self and reach others on, this universal level that I speak of, not to veil it necessarily, but open it up in a way to others being able to relate to it as well, but have that same kind of emotional response to it without having to think that it's for them or not for them, but to let them just have the experience of being inside it as well.
I think that happens, when you come into the space and you see this work, just the scale of it, and the curiosity that they're unusual pieces. And so there is, I think, an inherent curiosity for the viewer to put themselves inside of it and see what it feels like. And I think that part of the exorcism for you is that you are cutting through these conceptual ideas of paint as surface, as skin, as, one layer of something, to reveal how three-dimensional it really is for you, and in these works and in the thinking around them. I think that's pretty beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, with the fashion erasures, which happen to be very new, I'm still thinking in terms of fashion, the fashion of the veil, and the fashion erasures go to this universal level of questioning all standards and all expectations versus having more of a Islamic facade to it. Not that the veils don't also look like the burghers of Calais, or image of Virgin Mary's aligned against the wall. So yeah, not that they don't work on the same universal level, but the association is more immediate to see that as some form of dynamic reference.
But Annie, in your essay, you describe Zamani's performance work as having an insistent sense of humanity and a double consciousness, embodying life, death, the cerebral and the abstract, and connection and conflict. How do these various extremes reflect this humanity for you?
I mean, I think that's interesting. I think how they reflect humanity is because it's this fullness of experience that we've kind of been talking about, how we're not any of us a singular characterization that the world tends to want to make us be. And I think about this work and I think about life experience kind of from the inside out. of how we experience it more so than what we look on the outside, because we don't know what we look on the outside anyway. We know what we feel and what we go through, and everyone else sees the rest. So I feel that those extremes, they're life, right? We experience death of loved ones, we experience trauma, we experience joy, we experience so much richness in this short time that we're here on the planet. And I feel that his works as a whole, but I really, in focusing on the performances, see it most clearly, pull all of those together through imagery and movement, such as the arrows where the flowers are there, then they're cut, and it's so simple, but also addressing the beauty and how it passes. And so I think that, yeah, it's like, those are the experience of life, those extremes, and the fact that his works address them in this sort of surreal plane, like where they're shooting each other with paint guns and then sort of disappear into the background, where he's hanging on the wall looking like a painting, and it's sort of comical, but it's also sort of like, are we the art? I feel like his work puts life integrated with art, that it can't be separate. And then he's off the wall and then it's hanging, and there's a sort of humor, but there's also this very poignant, you know, life is a moment and then it passes.
That's great. Thank you, Annie. Annie or Jill, do you have any questions?
I think, I mean, I just would say that I think that thank you to MOAH, one, for this conversation, and also for recognizing Habib's contributions to the art world in Los Angeles County and beyond. I think that the arc of his career is so interesting, the way that he has moved and done multiple, you know, just how versatile he is as an artist, and I, you know, and it's wonderful that there's my dog, and it's wonderful that that we get to see his body of work in one space, which I think is, you know, obviously unique and wonderful. It's a celebration for any artist, but it's pretty spectacular to see his work together, because he has been thinking, as he said, of so many of these ideas, and it has driven him since graduate school to unpack so much of these conversations in his work. It's pretty amazing.
Right.
And he's it's so great. I agree. It's so great that you featured him in that way, and then he's also such a generous artist and such an experimental artist, and so known in many ways with his work bringing artists together in community and exhibitions and creating opportunities for artists to show work through post. And again, the thing that comes and goes, like this thread through his work where things are sort of birthed or embodied and then let go. I feel like much of his work has that flow, and his work with the community and post and creating this experimental space that was very energizing for a lot of artists and viewers, and myself included, and so many people. So it's great to focus on him and what he's making outside of that. So I really appreciate that.
Well, I do want to thank, of course, our esteemed panelists. Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Jill, again. And thank you, Habib, out there. On behalf of the museum and the city of Lancaster, we really appreciate your feedback and your contributions. And I do want to invite all of our viewers out there to come to visit the exhibition. The museum is open, and we have a wonderful series of exhibitions, both in the main gallery with Habib's work, but also in the surrounding galleries as well. So we invite you cordially to come and visit the museum and see the space for yourself. With that, I will wish you all a wonderful night. Thank you again for your time. Goodbye now.
Thank you.